Please allow me to warmly welcome you to today's seminar session, the 11th seminar session in series titled Curriculum Studies in Canada. My name is Ying Ma, UBC postdoctoral fellow and coordinator for this seminar series. I feel very honored to facilitate today's meeting. With the permission of our speaker today, this meeting will be recorded and they will become available on both of our website, curriculumstudiesincanada.ca, and our YouTube channel. Today, we are very happy and fortunate to have Dr. Jocelyn Létourneau from Université Laval and to give us a presentation titled What History to Teach for What Future of Canada? And now Dr. William Piner will introduce Dr. Létourneau to us. Welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Ma. Jocelyn Létourneau history at Laval, where he was awarded a Canada Research Chair. A former fellow of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, a member of the Royal Society of Canada since 2005, Dr. Létourneau was awarded in 2006 the Trudeau Foundation's Research Prize. In 2018, he was awarded the André Laurendeau Prize, one of the most important academic honors in Quebec and French Canada, for his overall contribution to the field of humanities. A regular visiting professor in foreign universities, he was the principal investigator in a SSHRC-funded community university research alliance entitled Canadians and Their Past. In 2010, he was a Fulbright Scholar at both the University of California in Berkeley and at Stanford. And in the fall of 2015, a visiting research associate at University College London, the Institute of Education. In 2019-2020, he held at Yale University's Macmillan Center the Fulbright Canada Distinguished Chair in International and Area Studies. He also served in the Department of History at Yale, as the visiting bicentennial professor of Canadian Studies. It's my privilege and pleasure to present Professor Létourneau.
Thank you very much, William. I hope that you can hear me without any problem. First, of course, I would like to thank William Piner and Anne Phelan for their kind invitation to participate in this webinar. Originally written in French, the paper has been translated into English by Wendy Peterson, to whom I am grateful for dealing with my not so easy prose. I ask the listeners to consider my talk as an exercise in scholarly exploration. I am perfectly aware that the question raised in this paper may be too big for me, and I'm certainly nervous to circulate my ideas. Nevertheless, I feel the question, which story of Canada should we tell young people, is an important one and need to be addressed. Last but not least, I hope my particular English accent, which multiple roots I cannot trace, does not bother you too much. I am not a specialist in educational sciences. In fact, I have no training in the field. My knowledge of the works published in this area of expertise is limited, to my regret. But although my historian colleagues do not consider me a suitably reverential acolyte of Clio, the time I have spent with practitioners of curricular studies has revealed to me that my sensitivity, tone, and expression are more to the taste of the goddess of history than any other divinity inhabiting those realms. My interest in grand collective representations, the ones that constituted nations doomed to perpetuate themselves over time, has led me into territories also visited by educational scientists. As a historian, I have always been primarily interested, unsurprisingly, in historic representations. How do Canadians or Quebecers write themselves collectively into the scripts of the past? Through which stories do they internalize their experience in time? How does this narrative of the self spread in a society? How is the history of we Canadians or we Quebecers, for example, told to children who are perceived to be the ears of a national experience and therefore the trustees of a history that must be known and carried into the present in order to colonize the future in the wake of the past? Inevitably, these initial questions led me to others, some shared by educators and pedagogues, as well as psychologists, neurologists, and memory specialists. How does a person construct their historical representations? How does a person assimilate the historical information that they encounter and use it to make sense of the world, to insert their individuality into the trajectory of time comfortably and contentedly? I will not try to distill the many works I have written chasing these questions. Since my interests lay in the production of collective identity, the creation of historical consciousness and the dissemination of historical knowledge in the community, and also in the importance of the social context of learning and the articulation of empirical and ideological knowledge in the construction of meaning on the personal or collective scale, it follows that I found myself in the domain of some important architects of educational science. An important role was played in this partial shift into the waters of curricular studies by Jon Rüsen, who invited me to take part in the work of the Historische Sinnbildung Forschungsgruppe, a multidisciplinary team that he created in Bielefeld, Germany, in the mid-1990s. This extremely inspiring man introduced me to Seyches, Weinberg, Van Boris, Ankersmit, Ahonen, and the list goes on. Needless to say that at the time I was taking and absorbing more than I was giving and contributing. Like other colleagues who have inspired me by their intellectual attitude, Rüsen, instead of pulling me back within the boundaries of a canon, encouraged me to expand on my intuitions. He urged me to observe my 4 children, then aged 9, 6, 4, and 1.5, to discover how they were crafting themselves into human beings, incorporating the notion of time in their self, and mastering the principles of narration, leading them to conceive of and perceive themselves as stories and mesh in other larger and more complex stories. Papa, tell me about when I was a baby, my 4-year-old daughter said to me one day, unleashing a flood of extensively elaborated hypotheses in a long text published in German. The next segment of my journey nevertheless veered me back into the production and assimilation of collective representations. How do nations, these imaginary communities associated with physical spaces and instituted structures, how do nations reproduce themselves also by forging and spreading a historical narrative? How is this historical narrative internalized by ordinary people who in so doing unconsciously nationalize themselves into matrices of meaning in which their individuality and identity are combined with the reality of a community inscribed over time? Now, instead of approaching this issue in the usual way, that is, from the positions of the proclaimers, the ones who produce meaning they hope will be taken entirely by the destinies, I planned to examine it from the position of the audience, those who receive the finished meaning and make something of it rather than, as people claim, simply reacting to what is flung at them. This reversal of perspective, I thought, would open up new prospects about what intrigued me, the probably highly complex marshalling of what is presented on one hand and what is received on the other. There is the origin of my empirical studies on the understanding that Quebecers foster and cultivate about the history of their society. Now, rather than interrogate my subjects, thousands of young students, about the trivia of Quebec's past, such as in which year was Montreal founded or who was the Premier of Quebec in 1867, I intended to ask them to tell or present the history of Quebec as they saw it, imagined it, or understood it. Of course, I reassured my subjects about my intentions. I did not expect any particular history of Quebec from them. They were free to structure their words, narratives mostly, but also lists, chronologies, drawing, and comic strips, as best they saw fit, as long as their offerings were anonymous, which gave them plenty of narrative latitude. There is no room here to elucidate the outcome of those investigations, which can be found in a number of other articles as well as a monograph. However, I would like to present some of the findings that stem from my research. Contrary to popular opinion, ordinary people, specifically here the young students I queried, but the finding holds true in older people as well, ordinary people are not completely ignorant of Quebec history. They know something about it, even a lot about it. A hodgepodge of statements of all kinds, factual or idealistic, gleaned here and there from the real curriculum and from what was offered to them as a cultural dory of sorts, which they do their best to attach to a simple but powerful narrative structure. For Francophones, this narrative structure pivots around the following key idea. We were had by the other, who prevented us from accomplishing what we otherwise would have, which led our history into a trajectory of resistance and our collective existence into an experience of powerlessness and bare survival. Unsurprisingly, Anglophones, young and old, do not have the same knowledge or representation of Quebec history. First, they largely incorporate it into the broader history of Canada. Second, undoubtedly to carve out a legitimate space for their group identity in Quebec's history, they insist on the need to recognize the diverse and pluralistic face of Quebec society over time. Finally, while they may acknowledge the tensions that have historically marked the relationship between Francophones and Anglophones, they reverse the roles of the villains and the victims. They also point out that the indigenous peoples have ever been, yesterday and today, the ones who suffered the physical, ideological, and political furor of the settlers, be they of French, English, or other descent. Clearly, Francophones and Anglophones are on the same side against the unfortunate natives, the only oppressed people on the national stage. I did not conduct a similar investigation among Canadians in other provinces, nor I am aware of any such studies other than among Francophone youth in Ontario and New Brunswick. That is a field ripe for the picking. Some indirect research I undertook has made me think, however, that if one were to ask English-speaking Canadians living outside of Quebec to recount the history of Canada, they would structure it around a set of historical themes and keywords that would include the following: pacifism, diversity, multiculturalism, compromise, agreement, unity, harmony, immigration, English, French, and First Nations. It is important to understand that in the eyes of many Canadians, Canada has become, for all intents and purposes, a moral ideal for the planet. The only blemish on the national portrait, the treatment of Indigenous people, eternal victims of their pitiless European invaders, English and French, equally abusive in their treatment of the First Peoples. All societies, all nations of the world have their own historical problematic, a sort of meta-representation that coalesces into a powerful image of what they were and continue to be from the years of yore to the present. Developed and honed by influential prognosticators, not necessarily historians, by the way, this problematic articulates a grand narrative of the self through which entities grasp themselves as or assemble themselves into a whole, and then consolidate and mythologize their trajectory through time. In the case of Quebec and French Canada, this problematic, which has the status of an emblematic, revolves around the ideas of duality and victimhood. In the case of English Canada, it is diversity and peace that fulfill the roles of collective ensign and drive shaft of the national narrative. In both cases, these are historical representations that, while not completely disconnected from a certain factual reality, twist the dense matter of the past into something unequivocal, clear, simple, and above all, meaningful. We would be mistaken to view these representations as mere fabrications. For example, it is clearly possible to recount the history of Quebec from the angle of adversity and struggle between two collective subjects, one of whom, the French Canadian, seeking national affirmation, is typed up by the other, the Anglo, who beats them back into survival mode, a kind of pathetic provincial subsistence. Likewise, it is possible to recount the history of Canada from the angle of cooperation, mutual respect, related communities, and unity and diversity, where each party making up the country, preferring compassion over force, is driven by the desire to found and build something good and lasting with the other. Canada has a drive toward mutual accommodation, wrote William A. MacDonald in a recent book titled Might Nature Be Canadian? This idea also brings to mind the long-winded speech pronounced by Justin Trudeau in the opening of the television series Canada, The Story of Us, broadcast on public television in 2017, in which the Prime Minister lists the fundamental traits of Canadianness: acceptance, respect, cooperation, unity, togetherness, etc. Now, between a possible history and an accurate history of an entity, say a country or a nation, there are, however, disconnects of greater or lesser degree. And this raises a very difficult question. If, going no further than these examples, the existing histories of Quebec and Canada, at least those circulating in public space that are internalized by ordinary people, including youth, if the existing histories of Quebec and Canada are revealed from the perspective of the accuracy of their problematics and the narratives they generate, to be out of sync with the complexity of the past, what problematics or narratives should replace them? In other words, what history can be told about Canada and Quebec that is accurate in terms of facts and historical processes and faithful to the complex matter of the once was, l'ayant été, to repeat Paul Ricoeur's formulation. That is the challenge of curricular studies. That is the challenge of curricular studies, not simply transmitting to pupils and students through the study of history decisive intellectual skills, for example, criticism, verification, analysis, interpretation, but also offering them a historical narrative that allows them to construct an idea about what was. Based on the investigation I conducted, of which one of the principal conclusions was that the constancy and strength of method struggled to overcome the resistance and preeminence of memory, I posit that only a structured, cohesive narrative can effectively overturn a prevailing organized narrative. Abandoning ordinary people to multiple perspectives by exposing them to interpretive diversity and initiating them into the logic of narrative construction in order to raise the level of their historical consciousness and enhance the depth of their critical competency generally produces disappointing outcomes. Guided by the complexity of the reflective processes demanded by historical thinking and disoriented by the plethora of possible narratives about the past, people who lack the referent points and means to confront this intricacy when left to their own devices, which is their customary condition, are loath to abandon the narratives they know, narratives that offer them effective schemes for understanding and that are handy for making sense of something that is not easy to master, but that they want to understand and convey simply the past. It is hard, unnatural, in Sam Weinberg's words, to approach the past using the principles of historical thinking, which rejects and indeed refutes the categories through which people instinctively approach reality in order to strip away its complexity and take hold of it. Once they are out of controlled learning environments, such as classrooms, where the teacher is there to guide them and soothe troubled minds, young people to focus just at this age group are pleased to encounter reassuring stories that allow them to align their personal historical consciousness with the historical representations put forward by their community of belonging and through which they connect with or are incorporated into a society. Contrary to one common opinion, which may underestimate the global social environment in which human beings evolve, learn, socialize, join, and become, living a historical space is far from a meaningless, painless process for a subject. It is no more or less than exiling oneself from a shared identity-based territory. It is easy to understand the hardship and reluctance some people might feel about cutting off the narrative moorings that attach them to the quay of their community, a place that represents self-affirmation and well-being. This triggers another question. would the historical thinking method be viable primarily for the trepidatious among us who yearn to veer away from familiar shores, for bright lights who enjoy surfing complexity, and for the erudite equipped to face the unknown? The definitive answer remains to be seen. I, for one, tend to answer in the affirmative to this conundrum, which so many educational experts dread. Whatever the case, as only a new historical narrative can, in my opinion, overthrow an existing historical narrative and open the subject to a new continent of understanding and intellectual emancipation, which story should be proposed about Canada to take this example? My intention is clearly not to offer a panorama of Canadian history in such a short time, nor to discuss the narrative form that the desired story of the Canadian past could take, except to say that it would be a kind of polythetic history similar to the one I recently developed for Quebec, focused on intermingled, ambivalent, dissonant, divergent, endo, and exogenous singular and universal processes through which a community advances through time in a kind of indetermination that leaves the future open to the plurivocal plans of its inhabitants and the multiple possibilities of their interdependence. In the next minutes, I plan instead to grasp at the essential and cardinal aspects of the Canadian historical experience, but stop myself from identifying an essence in it, imprinting a telos on it, or imbuing it with mystique. The challenge I have set down for myself is as follows: how to problematize the Canadian trajectory without emblematizing it, without imposing a retrospective teleology or prospective destiny on it, without subjecting it to either the rectitude of our era or the historical expectations of particular identity groups. How to raise questions about it rather than incite judgment, denounce the moral ideal it projects without rejecting the hopes it contains, avoid looking for lessons in it without fearing to uncover observations that are also its constants. And as if this order were not too tall enough, I also plan to place my historical problematic at the intersection of the concern for rigor, let's call it principle of truth, and the concern for relevance, the principle of responsibility. That is, at the crossroads of accurate prehension of what was and wholesome desire to move forward. Passer à l'avenir, as I stated in French. I want to come back to the expression Canadian historical experience, which is capital in my vision of things. With this expression, I mean that Canada is not a temporal given and a natural framework, but rather a historical construct and a progressive reality. Canada is not an a priori fixed reality or one that is definitely entrenched. It is the broadly unpredictable product of human action, the outcome of the actions of men and women acting individually and in groups, and who have the desire to establish a physical location and an economic and political field of action that reflects their outlook, ambitions, and specific interests, which tend more toward competition, dissonance, and divergence than toward concordance. From this perspective, Canada is not a completed or closed whole. It is a work in progress, a project in a continual state of incompletion because of the tensions generated by its indeterminate evolution. In fact, Canada is more of an open question than a conclusive answer, more of a sum of provisional arrangements than a definitive program, more of an unfinished composition than a completed score. Canada is not a moving poem or an exalting novel. It is a perennial draft. It is not a rational ideal that must be concretized at all costs by crushing dissent, but an approximated idea that we are trying to articulate through experimentation and contention. While this state of incompletion creates angst or frustration for some people who would prefer for everything to be determined, established, and firmly cemented, it is for everyone a means of freedom that allows us to build on what can still be erected, if such a thing is possible and worthwhile, which it likely is. The spelling of the word Canada eschews the history that the term claims to embody. Changing the first letter to a K would make the very label of the country reflect the indigenous primacy effect in the Canadian experience. And from now on, when I refer to Canada and to Canadian with a K, I'll touch my head. Otherwise, you would not notice the distinction with Canada and Canadian written with a C. So I said that the spelling of the word Canada eschews the history that the term claims to embody. Changing the first letter to a K would make the very label of the country reflect the indigenous primacy effect in the Canadian experience. While Canada developed historically as a society that was European in nature, the Canadian experience is rooted in indigeneity, which has never ceased to influence the nature of the country, despite being built by physically pushing the indigenous peoples away and rejecting their cultural heritage. But the term Canada does not reduce the Canadian experience to solely its indigenous component, which has not indeed been its most preponderant for a long time. Two other fundamental components of the Canadian experience, the French fact and the English fact, generic ensembles that harbor considerable cultural diversity, are also expressed in the name Canada, which can be pronounced in the French way or the English way without changing the spelling, corresponding well to the reality of the country whose two dominant linguistic communities coexist with the third separately together. The Quebec question is interesting to examine in the framework of a history of Canada seeking to escape from the usual problematics or emblematics of duality and victimhood on one side and diversity and peace on the other. Let's begin by saying that there is no history of Quebec that can be put forward outside the narrative of the Canadian experience, not for ideological or political reasons, but for historical ones. Quebec is consubstantial with Canadianity, which in return define Quebec's core identity. This, of course, could be denied, but there is evidence, large evidence to support it. There is, of course, a desire for nationhood in Quebec, in French Quebec, but it is very broadly, but in its very broadly dominant form, that has never been directed against Canada. It has always been rather a means to accentuate one of the country's fundamental, the constitutive duality of Canada, which has never been simple given the minority nature of the French fact in the country, Quebec's relative political isolation, and the inexorable tendency of culturally diversified national spaces of any sort to massify, homogenize, or crush their constituent surrounding or competing cultures. For the Québécois, the ideal of duality does not mean separated states, but reunited nations. It is easy to understand how in 1980 and in 1995, the fortunate expressions sovereignty association and sovereignty partnership convinced millions of Quebecers to vote yes on the question of a new Canadian alliance. Historically, the label Canada, with C this time, which relates back to the reality of a plan for the political, economic, ideological, and even nominative domination of a geographic space to colonize and then nationalize, somewhat naively obscures what it could never fully be: the effective achievement of the intended program. This is what led Peter Russell, in a recent work, to speak of Canada as a country based on a series of incomplete conquests. For him, the Canadian experience is the history of the abortive reduction of the indigenous peoples, the unsuccessful provincialization of the Francophones, and the failed nationalization of English Canada, as well as the outcome of this threefold situation: a country mired in continual tension, irritating and unequal, but in a sense creative and performative among its three founding pillars. The consequence of this vision is not meaningless, especially for those attached to the prevalent representation, a sort of mob vulgate for a highly complex legislative framework of Canada as a multicultural community. Presented as an ideology fully adapted to the Canadian diversity and magnified by its proponents as a refounding of the country, Canadian multiculturalism, in the context put forward by Russell's thesis, is precisely the opposite of what it claims to be. Although rehabilitated as a success by a few Willis spin doctors, it is at heart an admission of the defeat of the dominant powers in the face of the persistence, resistance, and resilience of minority entities, which have refused to cede to their resolution, pretensions, and impositions. In a sense, Canadian multiculturalism, associated as it must be with the concepts of federalism, bilingualism, provincialism, regionalism, democratic individualism, and even nationalism, all expression of the dazzling Canadian complexity and its irreducibility, is the acknowledgement that there is no way to smelt the country in a die in which the whole can subsume, swallow, or finally and fully dissolve its parts. Spelt this way by French explorers on their arrival, and later validated in that form by the English conquerors, the term Canada with a C is at heart the residual variable of the Canadian equation, its least common denominator rather than its grand integrating concept. There is an interesting point here. If we accept it, Canada appears, in effect, to be the relatively happy accident resulting from a failed plan of nationalist reduction and identity construction, which differentiates it from established models and typical cases. A source of vexation for Canadian nationalists, which include eminent historians worried about the eventual denationalization of the country from a want of historicization, the inherent shortcoming in the Canadian experience could in fact be a sufficiency or even a surfeit. If so, we should rejoice that Canada is a failed act or a series of failed acts, particularly because the minority and dominated position, despite the ordeals experienced and battles lost by those bearing or leading them succeeded ultimately in asserting their presence and sometimes their program on the majority and dominant positions. Fundamentally and paradoxically, very much so, Canada is a country of beautiful losers, to borrow Leonard Cohen's impressionist metaphor. Beautiful losers, not in the sense that Canadians, whatever the primary culture of belonging or allegiance, be it Anglophone, Francophone, or Indigenous, are a bunch of defeated fools, vanquished, milquetoast, or trans-second-rated beautiful losers, in the sense that in the wake of the unexpected outcomes of history and the limited strength of the powers articulating the Canadian experience, and also because of the visionary ideas of some players in the Canadian theater, there was no chance for any group or culture to completely dominate or fully control the national order, despite the lopsided nature of the relationship among the parties that make up the country. As such, and for historical reasons, let's not delude ourselves, the Canadian reality become one of obliged measure, forced compromise, and inevitable adjustments among the instituted powers and constituent parties. These three characteristics or dynamics of the collective experience hardening over time into a kind of political culture in which conversation and continual negotiation, underpinned by the differences and divergences that mark the reciprocal relationships of the three Canadian pillars, form the basis of their reconcilement, sometimes within reach, sometimes delayed, sometimes bungled, but never entirely satisfactory or dissatisfactory to anyone. While the Canadian historical experience is on the surface and primarily one of discord, dissension, strife, friction, disagreement, and conflicts related to the conquering impulses of the dominant groups that have succeeded each other over the history of the country, it is at a deeper level and fundamentally, at least so far, one of constrained interdependence, detached convergence, separated association, random intersection, asymmetrical compromise, disjoint collaboration, provisional arrangement, and uncertain adjustment stemming from the failure of those conquistadorial urges. On the basis of this problematic, what history should be taught about Canada to the contemporary hearers of the Canadian historical experience? While we can today be something other than what the past has made of us, we cannot do as we please with what once was. The principle of rigor must be at the center of the historical enterprise. There is no option, for example, of presenting the Canadian historical experience from the candid angle of perpetual compromise, continual concession, and mutual accommodation. While Peter Russell is accurate in asserting that the history of Canada is based on a series of incomplete conquests, the idea underlying his thesis is that powers did effectively and ardently seek to model the Canadian experience on their particular ambitions and interests. And in fact, there was historically an intention, a plan to reduce or eliminate, or in any event exclude the indigenous peoples of Canada, established as Canada with a C. There was an intention, a plan to marginalize or assimilate or even provincialize the French fact in the country. And there was an intention, a plan to acculturate or merge or in any event to homogenize the inhabitants of Canada into a uniform imposed vision of Canada and Canadian. Although for all sorts of reasons it turned out to be impossible to achieve these intentions and bring about these plans, the efforts undertaken and sometimes carried quite far had major structuring effects on the construction of Canada, effects that is impossible to undo or redeem in the present. A history of the future of Canada cannot be built by trivializing, gold plating, or overlooking these foundational processes. That said, while the Canadian experience is the story of failed, spoiled, or unaccomplished intentions and plans for assimilation, provincialization, and uniformization, which Russell associates with desired and affirmed attempts at conquest, other elements, be it players, factors, contingencies, processes, episodes, events, and phenomena, worked to reorient the intended designs or ended up thwarting the imagined, expected, or hoped for directions. And in fact, the Canadian experience is also a history of determined resistance and opinionated battles, headstrong protests and inspired visions, progressive actions, and generous decisions. To make this capital one of the axles of Canadianity and its narrative does not make the narrator a cheerleader for the nations, which personally I refuse to be. It is more a matter of recognizing that Canada, from which the Canadian route has never been successfully borderized, established itself amid an interlacing of powers, an ambiguity of systems, and a succession of ambivalent political crannies, which it continues to do today. In a sense, the Canadian experience is the confirmation that powers does not always manage to crush prospects, that the rationale of systems does not always squash the potential of life worlds, and that the omnipotence of conformity does not always suppress the possibilities of interstice, from which arise discrete movements and slender vitalities, vector of emergence, crucibles of thought and action, and even potentialities of transformation and progress. Without denying the presence and importance of power, systems, and conformity in the construction of the country, the history that is taught should also emphasize, in fair measure, of course, and within the framework of a polythetic historical narrative, should also emphasize the prospects, the potentialities arising from life worlds, and the opportunities deriving from irregularities that have marked the Canadian experience, and in the nooks of which have sprouted certain unexpected but attractive, or at least appealing, directions from the perspective of the possibilities for a heteroclitic and complicated entity to move into the future. This double insistence on powers and prospects, systems and life worlds, conformity and irregularity, is a reminder of the place of dominance in the configuration of Canada. But it is also a reminder of the possibility for people to change the order of things through their faculty of thinking and capacity of action in view perhaps of rebuilding the Canadian horizon from a Canadian tradition. Critical lucidity and political hope are certainly two values that the teaching of history must or how to inculcate in young minds. They are two cognitive and reflective horizons that harden back to two central concepts of the model of historical thinking: that of the methodical study of the past, and that of the ethical aspect appropriate to historical questioning and reasoning. A fruitful model is therefore reconciled with a country that remains open to be questioned in its past, its present, and its future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Létourneau, for your very insightful and passionate speech. And right now we are open for any questions or comments. So you just could unmute yourself if you have a question or want to make a comment. So go ahead. Give speak.
Gilles Bipot.
Oh yes, sorry.
Yeah. I'm not an historian. I was an educator. I am an anthropologist. I live in Quebec. It's about the very beginning, what you said. If we take the receiver perspective and not the sender perspectives in relation to this book, children and all that. In the interviews with the young people at the secondary school and CEGEP, and you were trying to find out their representation, their vision of the past.
Right.
Were you able to differentiate the impact of the family structure? What I mean is that what is taught at the school,
Yes.
what the books used by the teachers, what they bring as a story is something. But we know, not only in Quebec, all over Canada, there are also traditions in the family, in the lineage. If I take my own example, a family that came 4 centuries ago here, the founders, we have a lot of stories which have been transmitted one generation after the other ones. Then is it possible to find out the sources upon which then the children, the youth, are constructing their vision? What comes in the papers, in the news, the books at school, and the family heritage as well. Is it possible to find out something about those sources?
Thanks for the question. It might be possible, but I did not try to trace the sources of children's or kids' representations of the past. My hypothesis from the beginning, and I think that I was able to demonstrate it, is that they take their knowledge and their representations from multiple sources. From the classroom, that's for sure, but also from the family, but also from the books they may read, including historical fiction. They also take a lot of representations just listening to the politicians, for instance, political discourses, or watching the TVs, historical series that are broadcasted on TVs. In fact, the only conclusion I can come to is to say that there are multiple sources for people to take from in order to build their representations. And that is the main of my point, in the sense that if we think that we can overcome, thanks to the information that is transmitted to kids in the classroom, the overall cultural environment into which any person live most of the time, we are probably a little bit naive. There's a big fight, at least when history is considered, between method, basically what we teach the kids in the classroom, and memory. You come from a culture, you belong to a culture, you heritate, or you are being offered by that culture a certain number of cultural tools, including narratives, including historical representations. And you will belong to that culture because you have assimilated them, you share them. It's the way to communicate with similar others. And that is very powerful. That is very strong. Uh, uh, to detach yourself from this cultural tools, to detach yourself from this set of narratives, this set of references, is to exile yourself from your community. And that is a very tough and hard process to go through. So most people, while they may be open in the classroom, and that is a very artificial environment, while they may be open in the classroom to different informations, to different representations, the problem is not information. The problem is the articulation of these informations into representation. While they may be open to that into the classroom, when they go outside of the classroom, they are again bombarded by all those words, representations, narratives, cultural references. They internalize them, make those references part of themselves, and decide to go along with their culture. That is more a safe space, I would say, than to try to accept yourself from that culture in order, let's say, to be more open to a different set of information or a different set of representations. Now, just one more minute, if I can. In the present time, in Quebec at least, this is my hypothesis, we may be in a moment where a set of narratives, a set of references is challenged by the youth, the new generation, who does not recognize itself into this big grand narrative, very powerful, of resistance, survival, and powerlessness. That is my hypothesis, I may be wrong. They are looking, searching, they are open for something else. Now, you cannot build a different narrative completely out of anything. I mean, you've got a set of facts. I insist on that. Your narrative has to be rigor, as much completely rigor. So you have to use to build your new narrative, your new representation out of the objective facts that makes up the historical experience of Quebec. So we are perhaps in a moment where a new narrative could emerge, because there's a big overall change in Quebec, not because historians have decided it's time to change the narrative. Certainly not. I'm sorry, sometimes, I mean, my English is not very good, so I can control when it's written, but when I speak, I mean, sometimes it might not be as precise and as subtle and as clear than when it's written, especially when detranslated.
I would like to say something at that moment. I find you extremely articulate, Jocelyn, when you speak. I have the benefit of knowing this text quite well. Having worked on it for quite a while. One of the things that it has really brought up for me is the same way these ideas can apply now to our narratives of whiteness and all of the ways our society is trying to rewrite those stories of how our class structure so mirrors our race structure. And I think there are a lot of very useful avenues in Jocelyn's research that could also be used to address some of these issues. Just taking it outside of Canada and Quebec for a moment and putting it into our broader world, because we do have all of those same issues happening in our understanding of whiteness and race.
Yeah. Well, this is not a question directed to me, I suppose, but to all of those who participate in this webinar. This is an interesting point, because Gilles was there too about 2 or 3 weeks ago. We were part of a webinar where someone brought this idea that the whole history of Quebec, we were dealing with the history of Quebec that time, not the history of Canada, should be articulated around a problematic of racism. In other words, this variable of racism is so important and has been so much neglected up to now that it should be, first of all, reinserted into the narrative, but to the point of being one of the key point to articulating the narrative. Now, I'm sensible to your remark, but in the same time, I think that we've got to be very careful with this problematic, or with this narrative of racism, and probably it's not the way you want it to go, but yes, I mean, Black people, for instance, or any persons of belonging to a non-white group should have their place into the narrative. That is for sure, and that is not a matter of political rectitude or correctness. Sorry, it's a matter of history, after all. But what place, what part to give to this reality? For instance, racism. What place, what part to give to those who are non-white in Canada? That is the difficult problem, it seems to me. And my whole point in that paper was to say we should not let ourselves be absorbed by the political correctness of our time. We should not let ourselves be absorbed by the group's identity. We've got to take a distance with it. We've got to be very careful in using some concepts, in using some perspectives. We have to make the narrative as far as possible from any form of politics. Of course, it's always possible, I think, to associate a narrative with politics. But the farther the narrative is from politics, the better it is. That's for sure. Raphaël.
Bonjour, Monsieur Létourneau. Je vais parler un peu en français parce que je vais traduire après, juste pour ramener un peu le français dans la place. Je vois des francophones aussi. So hello, my English-speaking friend. So, Monsieur Létourneau, considering that conquests are always incomplete, unsatisfactory in Canada, as argued by Russell, that you cited a lot, should we, as educator, try to completely conquer students with a new narrative of Canada that you propose?
I don't know. William is aware of that. We had an exchange with Peter Seixas, who regret to be with us today. It was impossible to be with us, but we had an exchange this morning with Peter. My point is very easy. There's a big fight, a big battle between method and memory. If we leave that battle to go on, memory will always win over method. That's my profound feeling. I'm not happy with that, but it's the way it is. Now, according to the historical thinking method, which Peter is much associated with it, to criticize the actual narrative, to historicize them, and to give students the means to get into the structuring and the construction of these narratives is the best we can do, and that's enough. I think I agree that I agree that the historical thinking method is a big progress. It's a major advancement into the teaching business, the teaching process. But what I'm afraid of is that if we let the kids, we had this discussion many times, Raffaele, if we leave the kids at this stage with the means to understand how narrative are constructed, they're not equipped, they're not strong enough to fight the army of memory, the armies of memory, and after a while, either they would be on the ground, or they will borrow nice schemas that are provided to them by political or ideological powers, because most people, not all people, and we probably all belong in this webinar to those who like, to go against received ideas and then to challenge existing narratives. But most people just want to be happy. They want to make themselves, they want to make sense of themselves in relation with the group they belong. And for that reason, they will adopt much easily schemas that are simple, powerful, clear-cut, that gives them what they need in order to be happy, in order to understand things around them. I am in a society. Where do I come from? Who am I? Where am I going to? I don't want to reflect 3 days or 6 hours about that. The teacher in the classroom complicates the whole thing very much. I get out of the classroom, I'm confused. I need something clear to base my thinking, my personal thinking, including my historical consciousness, on it. So my idea, if we don't provide the children or the kids with a kind of alternative narrative that is based on complexity of things, and that doesn't go against the intellectual abilities that are carried on by the historical thinking method, we may, and I say may, provide them with something that can be used perhaps to counteract the power of the memory. Into that, Peter and I disagree very much. According to Peter, it's not the business of the curriculum program to go that far. It's not the business of the teacher, and it's not the business of the historian to be a kind of captain of society. My idea is certainly not to be a captain of society. My idea is just to say that we live in a world where there are a lot of battles about big ideas, big representations, and we should not be naive. If based on intellectual rigor, we don't provide children with a narrative that is as powerful and as structured and as coherent as the existing narrative, what will remain of what we teach them in the classroom after 2 years? what will remain in their mind when they are just, you know, walking on the street. And this is what I found in my research. I'm pretty sure that all those kids were submitted to historical thinking method, more or less. Teachers are not stupid people. I mean, they teach subtly complicated matters, but the force of the memory is so strong. The reinforcement of the cultural tools are so strong that it's very difficult for them to escape. Providing them with an alternative, a powerful narrative, might be a kind of rempart. Comment on peut dire rempart in English?
Fortress, I don't know.
No, not a fortress, but
A rampart is the same thing. It's a
rampart.
barrier.
A rampart.
A wall.
A wall.
Yes.
Yeah. But still, you know, I don't think that we should be very much naive. It's my thinking is that it's a whole change in a society, perhaps the replacement of a generation by another generation, like what happens in Quebec at the moment, that will bring the conditions for a new narrative to emerge and disseminate in the social scape, much more than the decision by historians to opt for another narrative, or much more than the only teaching in the classroom. We have to be modest, I think, as teachers and as historians. We don't change a lot of things.
Thanks.
Is there any more questions? I think we could accommodate one question if there is any.
I have one.
Yes, Kent.
Go ahead.
Hello, Jocelyn. You know, in 2011 in Curriculum Inquiry, we actually, my co-author and I, used your polythetic framework and had our students read Canadian history from two perspectives, not the grand narrative, the English grand narrative.
Yeah.
One of the things that came out of that was the emotive and affective difficulty. And sort of the subplot of what I hear you saying is perhaps not another narrative, but a comfort with discomfort through such, you know, Megan's work in affective theory and other works in curriculum studies, but also terror management theory. In other words, as you say, people need clarity, comfort, a story that combines them with their cultural others into a sameness. And that's kind of what, as teachers, we're trying to disrupt in some sense. And it's sort of a necessity for the effective and affectiveness of your call for a sort of polythetic framework. So I'm wondering, you know, and maybe that becomes then the pedagogical task in a sense, about the multiplicity of narrative possibility, but also requiring attention to the sort of terror, existential terror that invokes, provokes, convokes. And in your own thinking about this, have you paid any attention? Because I think with your debate with Peter, it's less about who will, and I think you're right, who will replace grand narrative X in Francophone Quebec or English Canada outside Quebec, and more about how it is that we're going to piece together but as Rusin says about narrative competence, the ability to learn from multiple narratives to learn something about a way collectively to move better into the future. So I'm just curious then if the debate really is about who will replace the narrative. And again, I agree with you, no one's going to dictate that, but rather as the educative project becomes working with students to recognize the multiplicity of possible and preferable narratives, but also the emotional difficulty of letting go of inherited stories and choosing new ones.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, thank you for the question. It's a very hard one. I don't think that we can have a statement that is universally true. If I take the Quebec example, as you know, history is taught in the secondary level. during 2 years. It's a kind of national history course in grade, let's say, 10 and 11. My feeling is that those we call in Quebec the allophones, for instance, are not, I mean, they are thought the usual narrative, insisting on resistance and the fight between the Franco and the Anglo, the presence of the church, and so on and so forth. But they seems to be indifferent to that narrative, because first of all, they don't have to carry on their shoulders Quebec's past, and they want a narrative that make themselves, give themselves a place in actual Quebec, in contemporary Quebec, and is strong enough to give them meanings to understand Quebec's past. And they don't believe that the traditional narrative plays that role. In the traditional narrative, the Anglophones, of course, are portrayed as the villains. So again, I mean, they're a lot reluctant to this traditional narrative. And even the Francophones, we are now 60 years after the Quiet Revolution. Even the Francophones, I mean, this discourse of survival doesn't ring a bell into their minds. They don't, in a way, they believe less and less into that narrative that does not have a practical effect for them, a practical use for them. So we are in a situation where the overall conditions might exist for a new narrative to root into the collective imaginary. This explains a lot the battle that we have experienced in the last 10 years over the dominance of the narrative that should be taught in the classroom. What history to teach the kids in the classroom? The traditionalists, the nationalists want, of course, this narrative to be as nationally oriented as possible. Others would like that without, I would say, saying that the national question is, the others, without rejecting the fact that the national question is central in the historical experience of Quebec, want to focus on other important matters. Overall, to the point that overall the narrative could be different. And we are in this situation at the moment. I don't know the future. At the moment, if we would go into the classroom and try to see or to study what narrative is being taught to the kids, we would probably discover that the traditional narrative is still quite strong. But again, the consequence of that is that, and I think that James Verch has written extensively about it, people will use a narrative, but without believing in that narrative. That might be what is on the verge to be in Quebec at the moment. But as I don't know the future, I don't know how to answer your question. But my point is that if for a new narrative, I think to become dominant in a society, the social and political conditions have to be present. Otherwise, it's very difficult to challenge a narrative because it answered a need for individuals or for a group to it fulfills a need for an individual or for a group in terms of where do we come from, where are we going to, and who we are. And I'll finish on that. For instance, to try to bring this idea that Quebec culture is the sum of its historical heritages more than the result of one important culture only, might open the space to revisit the history of Quebec from a kind of pluralistic vision rather than a monolithic vision.
Yeah, I think you were getting closer to my concern when you talked near the end about a need for. And here again, Megan Bowler, is who I was thinking about, and mangled her name, my apologies. But also Ernest Becker's work on the existential need to belong. I think it was brought up in the earlier question in relation to the role of the family contributing to particular narratives and not other kinds of narratives. Mm. And so that the educational question for me, as you know, over the last decade has become, what is this need for? And perhaps that ought to be the object of our historical educational attention.
Yeah.
Because the ability to engage with a polythetic framework in your language or narrative competence in Roussen's requires that capacity to look at what need in me is this belief in Canada as a meritocracy serving, and how might that limit my capacity to engage in alternative readings of the facts, because the facts don't speak for themselves.
No,
as you
know.
No. So my ability to engage with Canada with a K and Canadien, and Canadiente, would require an emotional education, or an education that takes the emotional affective components as seriously as the method.
Yeah. Yeah.
Great. So in the interest of time, I think I will close today's session. I want to thank Dr. Létourneau again for your fascinating speech and the discussions we have had today. And I also want to thank Dr. William Piner and Dr. Anne Phelan for hosting this seminar series and those who make this possible. And our next seminar session is scheduled on March 30th, 2021. We look forward to seeing you then. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much.